Hello, my name is Claude Blanc, and I am the publisher at New City Press. Welcome to our first webinar of 2021, All Brothers and Sisters, an Interfaith reading of Fratelli Tutti. It is the first webinar of our new series, One Family 2021. In his latest encyclical, Pope Francis highlights where our modern world has to change. From its economic and political framework to its approach regarding social justice, climate justice, and war. And those topics involve all of us. Therefore, the Pope invites believers of all faiths, all religions, to work together for a more fraternal world. How can we build universal fraternity? And we thought it would be great to have a conversation with some of our brothers and sisters, Jewish and Muslims, to see how they respond to this call and what their perspective is on this topic. So today, our panelists are three. The first one is Father John McNerney, who is a resident in Washington, D.C. He is the Michael Novak Distinguished Scholar at the Georgia Center for Principled Entrepreneurship at the Catholic University of America. He lectures in the fields of business ethics and philosophy. John, welcome. Our second panelist is Imam Tariq El-Amin. He is the resident at the Masjid Al-Taqwa in Chicago, a community in association with the leadership of the late Imām W.D. Mohammed. He advocates for justice, equity, and human dignity. Imam Tariq is completing graduate studies in Islamic chaplaincy at Bayan-Chicago Theological Institute. Tariq, welcome. And finally, Rabbi Burton Visotzky is the director of the Milstein Center for Interreligious Dialogue and of the Finkelstein Institute for Religious and Social Studies at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. Rabbi Burton has worked for many years in the interfaith dialogue, has been quite involved also with the Vatican and with the World Council of Churches in those issues. So again, welcome.
Thank you.
After the first part of the presentation, Susan Jensen, who is the editor-in-chief of Living City magazine, will be facilitating the Q&A session. So during the webinar, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to enter your questions, and we will try to answer as many as we can at the very end. Tomorrow, you will get a new email from us with a number of resources that will help you continue on this journey, on this path. And the recording of the webinar will be available on our platform, on our social media platforms, on YouTube, actually. So again, let's get into the meat of the subject. And I will start with you, Bert. So I know that you've been working with the Vatican for quite a long time, and you're familiar with Pope Francis, and I know the respect you have for him. But I'd like to get your take on this encyclical. What was your reaction when you read it?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, and I'm especially grateful to be here with Claude, who was a study partner of mine for many years. So it's lovely to be here. And I do want to rehearse a little bit that I have long ties with the Vatican. In 2014, I taught at the Gregorian University, and then, I'm sorry, that was in 2007. In 2014, I was at the Angelicum, and then I met the Pope each of those times. I met him again in 2015 when Pope Francis came to New York City, and we all met at Ground Zero. And then twice more in 2017 and 2019. I say this because I have enormous esteem for Pope Francis, and I think by and large that Fratelli Tutti is right on point. All that having been said, though, as a Jewish reader of the encyclical, when I get to paragraph 59, which specifically addresses the Jews, I take umbrage. I find that it is difficult, and it has, for me at least, a whiff of supersessionism. He talks about early Jewish traditions limiting love your neighbor only to loving Jews. And while there certainly were some rabbis who thought that's what the commandment meant, the vast majority of the rabbis thought that love your neighbor meant everyone. And they thought that particularly because in that same chapter of Leviticus, we are told to love the stranger. We are told that Hillel, a first century contemporary of Jesus, negatively formulated the golden rule, whereas Jesus did it in a positive way. There are just these subtleties that I think do disservice to the embrace of the encyclical itself. I genuinely believe that Pope Francis means to embrace the Jewish community, because I know that one of his partners in dialogue and one of his co-partners in writing is a rabbinic colleague of mine. And so I have no doubt about his good intention. But the encyclical, as it is written, leaves me wanting a little more.
And so, how do you see that perspective of creating that fraternity among all? How do we overcome the hurdles?
Well, the hurdles are many, but they have been diminished for the past 55 years. There is no secret to anyone listening on this call that for almost 2,000 years, the Catholic Church and the Jews were not what we would call friendly with one another. If anything, there was a great deal of enmity. But since the promulgation of Vatican II and Nostra Aetate, now celebrating its 55th year, the church has done enormous work theologically and practically in reaching out to the Jewish community. And we in the Jewish community, in turn, are grateful to and happy to be partners with the church. When I was in Rome in 2019, I was there as part of the liaison committee, which meets regularly with the Vatican to talk about issues between the Jewish and the Catholic communities. My friend Cardinal Dolan in New York said it very nicely. He said, yeah, we've had a lot of dialogue, and a lot of it has been dialogue of grievance. I'm complaining about this, you're complaining about that. But now we are able to move beyond that. And I think Fratelli Tutti is a step in that direction, to move beyond grievance to really working together to do the things that are commanded of us by the New Testament, by the Hebrew Bible, and indeed, although I'll let Tariq speak to it, I believe by the Quran, that we feed the hungry, clothe the naked, house those who are without a roof over their head. There's so much work to be done in this world, and it will be done much more effectively if we do it together. And I really think that Fratelli Tutti, the encyclical, lays out a path for us to do that. And for that, I'm very grateful.
Very good. Thank you, Bert. Now, Pope Francis told us that an inspiration for his encyclical was his meeting with the Grand Imam Ahmad Al-Tayyib in Abu Dhabi, I think it was. What does that mean to you, Tariq, that an Islamic scholar and an imam was the inspiration for the Pope, or was one of the inspiration for the Pope in this? And how do you read this encyclical?
Thank you for the question, Claude, and thank you for the opportunity to join this esteemed panel and to have this conversation about this encyclical. For me, it represents a moving beyond the theoretical and looking at what are the practical applications, what are the practical implications of these shared values. When we think about in Islam, the term Khalifa, as a steward, as one who is responsible for the social order, the social cohesion. This Fratelli Tutti was ingrained throughout the reading. It was a call for shared responsibility, and as a student of and in association with the leadership of the late Imām Muhammad, who took on the title of Muslim American spokesperson for human salvation. This is a book, this encyclical, it spoke directly towards the core of what it is for us to be redeemed. What is it for us to be saved from our own destructive tendencies? And what is the mechanism that faith can play in that redemption, in that path forward? So I was very much pleased with the references, and not simply from a sense of, he mentions an imam, but pleased in the sense that there is a sense of understanding that, when we say think about in community organizing, you think about, the term, the wisdom is in the room. The wisdom in terms of our ability to address our problems, it must include those who are outside of our own ideology, those who are outside of our own comfort zone even. So I was very pleased with that. And I saw human dignity. And if I could, I want to just reference one of the points that really stood out to me was it says, it's on page 155, this should be acknowledged that among the most important causes of the crisis of the modern world are a desensitized human conscience. And this is, I think, part and parcel to the goal and just a common thread that goes throughout the encyclical, the reawakening of the conscience, and doing that from multiple vantage points that makes room, not just makes room for, but includes the different perceptions, and promotes them, right? So this was I really enjoyed it, and I found myself shaking my head, all throughout. Yes. You recognize truth when you hear it. So there's a lot to build on from what was shared here by Pope Francis.
Very nice. Thank you so much, Tariq. So now, John, tell me what, from your perspective as a priest in the Catholic Church, how do you see that call that goes way beyond the church itself, that embraces all of humanity? Well, how do you respond to this?
Well, I was thinking this morning of, and by the way, it's fantastic experience, like what we're living now through this virtual, but we are real to each other. To talk with Bert and Tariq, like you're allowing me to read this through your eyes, which is, which is living the challenge I see in itself. Like, I was thinking early this morning, I remember Neil Armstrong's words, and he said, one small step for man, one giant leap for humanity. I'd say, in terms of discovery of who the human person is, who the neighbor is, we're still far away from a joint leap. So the encyclical, in one sense, is that small step that we're taking together. It's very interesting to me that when they did land on the moon, the astronauts brought with them texts and gifts from all world leaders. And one leader was Paul VI. And what I found very interesting to know that the text that Paul VI left on the surface of the moon was Psalm 8. O Lord our God, how glorious is your name. When I look upon the heavens, you are there. What is man that you're mindful of him? You've made him little less than the angels, than God. Just to say, when I look at the Fratelli Tutti, what strikes me very much is Pope Francis reflects on how without the other, we're not who we are as human beings. And if we ask the question, I think as Tariq said, and I see this very much as true, this is not an armchair bound analysis of who the neighbor is. Nowhere, in fact, as far as I could see, nowhere in the letter does he actually define fraternity. And actually, to try and define it in itself is a failure to realize that the other person is a mystery of God, and everyone is unique in that. So to me, the big leap requires conversion and humility. Lonergan, a Canadian philosopher, talks about conversion as being intellectual, moral, and spiritual. So I think that's our beginning, in a sense, that who the neighbor is can't be answered by a definition, only by my conversion. He remarks, Pope Francis remarks in paragraph 80, he remarks that Jesus asks us not to decide who is close enough to be our neighbor, but rather that we ourselves become neighbors to the other. So the emphasis for me, and I conclude now, Claude, in the initial remarks, is the emphasis for me emerges, it's not necessarily a theoretical, working out of who the neighbor is, but it's a search for the other in the midst of the situation we're in. And I'd say that's the forgotten dimension in politics and in society at large.
Yes, so interfaith dialogue oftentimes has been the job of professionals. How do we bring that to the grassroots? How do we create that society? I mean, when we look at our society today, we are really far from being a society of brothers and sisters. Okay? So how do we transform that? And I'm going to address that question to Bert to start with, because in the past few years, the incidents of anti-Semitism have been on the rise, and antinomy and aggressivity between the various tribes, I would say, has been on the rise. How can we bring that spirit of fraternity to the grassroots, also to the grassroots when they feel themselves oppressed?
Thank you. I think that we have to act on two levels. And when I say act on two levels, I don't mean in any way, shape, or form to diminish the engagement of clergy one with another. Professionals do have what to add. But on a laity level, on a day-to-day level, we do need to talk to our neighbors. We need to invite them into our homes. We need to have them at in my case, at my Sabbath table or at my Seder table, and celebrate with them. Because if they know how we celebrate and they can enjoy our holidays, we can enjoy their holidays. My seminary has for many, many years now sponsored an iftar dinner during the holy month of Ramadan, so that we can feed our Muslim brothers and sisters when they end their fast. And that goes a long way. We need dialogue. My seminary, in fact, tonight, I will be engaging in a Bible study group on the book of Genesis with people from the Jewish Theological Seminary and our African-American neighbors in Harlem from the St. Matthew's Baptist Church. But that's not enough. Study is good and enjoying one another's company is good, but we also need to do for one another. In this terrible time of COVID, when my sister, the Reverend Lisa Jenkins, who is the pastor of St. Matthew's Church told me that she was concerned that she had parishioners in her church who were not getting tested for COVID and who didn't have gloves and masks and know how to behave properly. Well, we joined together to make sure that these people could get tested and could get masks and could survive. Why do we do that? We do that because they are our neighbor, and I have this obligation. So sometimes it's doing, because when these folks got their masks, they knew that the Jewish Theological Seminary was partly responsible, that we love them enough and care enough about them, that we will take care of them as we take care of our own. And the same is true in our relations with the Muslim community, whether in New York City, where I live, or nationally. I'm very engaged with the Islamic Society in North America, and then internationally as well. And I want to say, because I really heard Tariq speak, and I wanted to say when he finished, Amin. So I have to say Amin to El-Amin. But indeed, and John, your words as well. We have to listen with our ears, but the words have to go to our hearts. And I'm grateful for both of my dialogue partners today, because you have already achieved that for me. Claude, you must unmute.
Somebody muted me. So, Tariq, I have traveled throughout the Middle East, and I have enjoyed the hospitality of so many people through my travels in Turkey, in Iran, in Pakistan, in Afghanistan. And Pope Francis speaks about hospitality in his encyclical. And again, talking about the grassroots. How do you see that reality being incarnated, being real within your life and with your community?
You know, hospitality, it is a part of culture. And when I think about, say for some indigenous communities, Native American communities, the tradition of hospitality, it would go so far as to, you know, it places the stranger, right? We think about not just hospitality to those we know, but think about, you know, how does that impact the stranger? The stranger would be elevated, will be given a position of honor, right? There'd be practices where the stranger joining the group would part with a gift, right? But I reference that because when we think about how our responses are intuitive, these responses are actually they're built up. They're part of cultures, the practices that are handed down to us, and sometimes they're handed down to us without explanation. And other times we gain the benefit of the ritual practice, and we understand the theme or the wisdom behind it. To your point, to the question that you're asking, how does hospitality impact my own community? It really is. I would like to think that being an African-American Muslim, coming from a history where a statement like, you know, if there's enough for one, there's enough for two, right? That this type of thinking, this perception, it forces one to lean into a natural, to remain in a sense of being hospitable, to remain in a sense of and have an attitude of sharing. I think when we think about how to really spread that, it is something that's spread through practice, and it is not a hospitality or a sharing that is done with the sense of sacrifice, a sense of loss, but a sense of celebration. And I think when you're in the presence, especially of people, you know, we use the term poor, but it often is a misnomer, right? It often really negates the wealth of spirit that exists in communities that may not have material resources, but they recognize that connection. They recognize the responsibility towards their brother and their sister, and they are happy. They are pleased. They feel a blessing in being hospitable, in being able to share, to cut that one portion in half to share with their brother or sister. So I think opportunities for sharing that are not dependent upon, excess, that are not dependent upon quantity, but simply opportunities where people can sit down, they can open their homes up. As Bert mentioned, he kind of go back to the idea of sharing a meal. That's kind of a great starting point. But whenever we're able to share resources, whatever they are, meager as they may be, but doing it with a sense of gratitude, a sense of jubilation, I think that helps us to spread and to engender a culture of hospitality. So I think that's something that is probably easier. It's probably just as easy to do as it is to say it. It's just a matter of, saying, putting it on the calendar, right? Just being intentional about creating those opportunities for hospitality. So it's something we try to do, we try to lean into. And of course, we can always do more.
Right, Tariq, thank you. For you, John, what exactly does it mean to build a society where fraternity is the rule?
Well, it means to me, not being just a spectator, as I said, an armchair traveler, in becoming who I am as a human being, that the other person is really who I am. That requires a lot of letting go, because I have a big ego, man. I have a big head too, full of myself. One small micro formula that helps me a little bit comes from Karel Lubick, who's a spiritual writer and founder of the Focolare movement, and who was a great friend of W.D. Muhammad. Is that this way of life is a style of living. A small little micro formula is, be the first to love, take the initiative, put the other person first, and then be always ready to start again. So I'd have different small experiences of trying to live that, in daily life. I could share a very brief experience if we have the time.
Please do, yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'll be very brief. I was at Dulles International Airport in Washington, D.C., and I had to make my way home late at night, and I was using public transport. I don't have a car. So as I moved outside the terminal, it was all in darkness. And I was a foreigner, a stranger, and I was really, quite worried. But I saw someone in the dark, and so I decided to ask this person, does the bus go from here to the metro? And he says, oh yeah, it does. And I had my suitcases, and he said to me, can I help you? I said, oh, no. I'm okay myself. So we waited in the darkness. And then I was thinking to myself, what on earth, John, are you living? Are you living at any of those points? Be the first to love, put the other first. And so I said I wasn't. So I eventually was close to this guy and said, hello, my name is John. And he shook my hand as well. I said, look, I just arrived back from Ireland, back from a family wedding. And he said, oh, that's very nice. And I asked him where he was from, and he told me, and that he now worked at the airport in Dulles, and that this was his normal route home each evening to his family. And he told me that the round trip takes him almost 2.5 hours, and that his little son and daughter often wait up to greet him. So in the meantime, the bus arrived, and I should say this guy, his name was Mohammed. And so both of us got onto the bus. And I think the bus driver was quite amazed how we were, chatting and talking with each other. So in the 30 or 40 minutes it took to get to the metro station, we talked about ourselves. And then we got onto the metro train itself. That took another 45 minutes. And Mohammed showed me photos of his little family, of a boy and a girl and their traditional dress on the feast of Eid. And he asked me different questions. He said, John, are you married? I said, no, Mohammed, I'm a priest. He said, oh, I know what that is. And he said to me, do you not feel you should be married? That's a great sacrifice. I said, oh, yes, Mohammed, it is. And looking at your beautiful family, I see that it is such a sacrifice. But Jesus, who your prophet, Muhammad, God be gracious to him, speaks of Jesus, who said, whoever leaves father or mother for my sake will gain 100-fold. And I then said to Muhammad, look, Muhammad, I suppose you and I on this metro are the little 100-fold. So Muhammad then looked at me and he said, Mr. John, you're right. We have a common humanity, and the Prophet Muhammad, be good to him, says this too. So my friend Muhammad then looked at me and more or less said, look, we could have looked at each other tonight as total strangers and just pass each other by. But the divine spark within us didn't let that happen. So, it's a little small experience for me of John rolling up your sleeves and taking the initiative. Of course, the lovely thing with Muhammad was it was reciprocated. He was the first to love me. I was perfectly content to remain in the darkness.
That's a great illustration, John. That's a really great story. So we live in a very polarized world, and some of the polarization, certainly we are each one responsible for it. We can all do something individually about it, and as John's experience shows us, it's possible. But there are also constraints in our society. There are societal constraints. Bert, I'd like to hear from you. How do you see? How can we overcome our tribal settings and create also the structures that will allow us to develop more harmoniously as a fraternal society?
Thank you for asking. And I want to comment. First thing I want to comment on is, and I privately chatted to Tariq, just those wonderful words to live by. If there's enough for one, there's enough for two. That should be everyone's rule, and it should be in everyone's kitchen as a principle of hospitality. John, you talked about being on the bus and on the metro and seeing the divine spark. And I want to tell two stories about the divine spark that I think in some way answer your question, Claude. And the answer is an answer about the courage it takes to do that. When our ancestor Jacob was returning from 20 years in exile, and in those 20 years, he feared his brother Esau's wrath because he had cheated Esau. And Esau was hoping to kill him. And the night before Jacob confronted Esau, he was up all night wrestling with a man, with an angel. He divided his camp. But when he finally saw Esau, Esau hugged him and kissed him and wept. And Jacob's response to that was, looking at your face, I see the face of God. And that is a huge, huge moment, that would it were true that every time we look at someone, a stranger, an enemy, that we see the face of God. John was able to do that on his metro. Maybe the lesson of your story, John, is that you should be riding the bus more. We all should. But in another study group, a young rabbinic colleague said the following, and it just really struck me. He said, hatred veils the divine spark. And I think that's something we confront. We are in a culture right now where there is so much hatred, and it precludes us sometimes from seeing the divine spark in the other, from seeing the face of God. And it's up to us to respond to hatred with love. And that's hard to do. It often comes at great cost, but I think we are obligated to do that. And John's narrative, I think, shows us how beneficial it is that instead of being strangers on a long ride, you make a friend, you meet a fellow human being, and you see the divine spark.
Yeah, thank you, Bert. This is very good. I'd like to ask you, Tariq. Now, when you live in an environment that has been the object of hatred, and both as a Muslim and as an African American, how do you see? How can we reverse that course? What do we need to do to reverse that course?
That's a great question. First, I think I look at this through two different lenses. And first, the presumption of living in an environment where there's hatred directed towards you, and believing that that means that you also would embody that hatred, right? That you would also allow that hatred to cloud your own vision, become the lens through which you see yourself, right? So there's two different things that are going on. It is, you recognize what is the environment that you're in, but you also recognize your own sense of agency in being able to create your own environment within a hostile environment. And that has been very much, I think, emblematic of what it is meant to be an African-American, be Muslim, to be any identity that has been marginalized, that has been that has fallen victim towards hatred, where you have had to recognize your own, the divine gifts that have been invested into you, recognize your own beauty and your own worth, and celebrate that, because to do otherwise would really amount to your own destruction. So, there are multiple things that are going on as far as, how do you respond to it? How do you push back? The response has been to not let that be the lens through which you see yourself. And the additional response has been, I guess, to some degree, to try. And I'm a little hesitant to say this way, because I don't want it to come off like, we're carrying the burden of changing people's minds, right? Because that has far too often been the case, where African Americans feel like they have to prove themselves to be more intelligent, more worthy, to have a greater work ethic. Muslims feel like they have to be more patriotic, they have to be more pacifist, more American, right, in order to just reach the baseline. And I really feel like that is a detrimental space to be in, because what it does, it allows us to lose our humanness. It allows us to, it puts us in that model, quote unquote, minority status, in which, there's no real and authentic existence, living in that kind of bubble. We lose the nuance of what it is to be an individual who can grow, who can be fallible, while at the same time aspiring, to be better, to live into and embrace, this shared potential that we have. I'll close by saying that the hatred becomes par for the course. The difficulty in that is that even as you celebrate your own triumphs, your own humanity, it can make you suspicious, right, of others outside of your group, right, others outside of your own experience. And that is definitely, unfortunately, that is to our shared detriment. It's not something just impacts me as an African-American Muslim. It is something that impacts everybody outside that does not, describe or share that identity. And that's definitely something that's a point where dialogue and these opportunities that we get to engage one another and build relationships that go beyond this dichotomy, this toxic dichotomy that we exist within, this black-white structure, we get to undo it. So it is a struggle, but it is certainly worth it.
Yeah. So what you're describing here, what would you say is the key to get beyond that? I mean, you're saying encounters, a dialogue. How much can we create opportunities for this? How can we go about it?
First, I'll say that because we recognize that words have power. Our words, from a theological sense, right? These words have power, right, to shape our moral perspective, not just to allow us to act from a standpoint of courage, but to actually encourage, right? For allow us to be sources of encouragement for others. The names themselves, and what I mean by that, these names actually matter. In order for us to really get to a point, I think, where we can have real lasting dialogue and productive, that move beyond dialogue, I think we have to look at, like I said, once again, this toxic dichotomy of black and white. The idea of white in and of itself, it has no true value. It has no real cultural relevance other than to disparage anything that is not white, right? Or to give an unearned sense of authority or merit to whiteness in and of itself. I think as we move away from that language and really start going back to, we think about, there's a value, there's a cultural tradition that is associated with being Irish in America, right? As an Irish American, as a Lithuanian American, as a German American, as a Jewish American, as an African American, right? Now, that's probably the one, you think about the uniqueness of that particular experience, and the cultures that has come from it. I think we are able to engage with one another in a much deeper way, that allows us to push back from that superimposed division, right, that exists with black-white. So I think that's a huge part of us being able to undo, some of that toxicity that we live with, and really to embrace and to really expand our opportunity for collaboration and shared responsibility.
Yes, thank you so much, Tariq, for this. So we do have several questions in the Q&A box, and so I will invite Suzanne to come on board to facilitate that part. But before we do that, I would like to recognize our sponsors, which are New City Press, Living City, the Church Center of Catholic University of America, and the School of Law of Fordham University. And we thank them all. Suzanne, up to you.
Yes, thank you to all the panelists for these inspiring contributions. The first question goes to Rabbi Visotzky. And so about the way how to implement a message of a shared responsibility. So what can non-Jews and Jews do to assist in the healing and moving more away from the dialogue of grievance towards a shared responsibility?
Thank you for that question. I think it's spot on. And I want to say that my brother Tariq went a long way already to starting to answer that. If we were in a live panel and not on screen, when he finished speaking, I would have gotten up out of my chair and gone over and hugged him because he spoke so much from my heart. I want to reiterate what I said earlier, though, because I think Jews, Christians, Muslims, all people have certain commandments we live by. And one of them is to not stand idly by. We see our brother or sister in need and we help them. That means that every church, every synagogue, every mosque should have a food bank. And if they don't, then they should be partnering with the local synagogue, church, or mosque, and together feed the hungry. We should be offering shelter to those who have no place to sleep at night. We should all have clothing banks to literally clothe the naked. It's just a case of putting aside a closet in your church or mosque or synagogue where people can donate their nice clothing and their clothing that they no longer wear, or in my case, the clothing I no longer fit in after all these months sitting at home noshing all day. You know, why would you ever throw things out when you can literally recycle them by giving them to people in need? Nowadays with COVID, we have an obligation. In my synagogue on our listserv, everyone has been sharing stories this week of how in New York State they managed to sign up to be able to get vaccinated. And we have to help one another to learn how to do that, because God willing, everyone will follow the science and everyone will go out and get vaccinated, and our country can get back to work and get back to being able to hug one another again. So I think there's lots we can do, and that's, I think, the operative word is do. We can do things together, not just talk, but do. And when you work shoulder to shoulder like that, you share one another's stories, you find out about each other's kids, parents, each other's troubles. And when you know one another's troubles, that's when you love one another.
Thank you. Our second question goes to Father John about, like, how can we find out who our neighbor is in this atmosphere of polarization? And people whom we want to know, they will not share, they will not trust, and they don't want to be more united. How can we build more trusting air and the spirit of fraternity with those who do not want to move forward?
Yes, well, that is the challenge. I always say to folk, if I give a little talk, they say, "Oh, thank you very much. That was very nice." Well, I say, it's all very well talking. The big challenge is to live it. I remember being in Cologne with a group of young people, and they were sharing, experiences of this style of living, going outside of oneself, being the first to love, put the other person first. And someone, a personality there, thanked these young people for these lovely experiences. And he said, I think it's relevant to today. He says, look, the challenge today is these small experiences are islands of humanity, small oases. Our challenge is to connect up these oases together so that the spiritual desert around us disappears. there is no doubt, I would think, we are in the minority. But there's such thing as being a creative minority too. I get great encouragement from that point in the art of loving, to be always ready to start again. And that requires us, I would think, of enlarging our hearts to the measure of God's unconditional love for each one of us. The measure is his love. So I think, it brings us into the source of that kind of life, which is only in God. And to go back to Bert's point about the Jewish tradition, of course, the beautiful Old Testament laws concerning strangers in Exodus and Leviticus as well. Just to conclude, I think it requires us to see the other with new eyes and make a pact of mercy. I have to try and do that here in the house in St. Patrick's in the city with other people who annoy the hell out of me. So I can become who I am through the other. Like we speak about human dignity, but dignity is actually fundamentally to lose myself, to empty myself. I'm reminded of, just conclude with this, the words of Pope Francis, which he cites in Fratelli, Tutti. He said a prayer at Yad Vashem Memorial in Jerusalem. I just say it. He says, Lord, remember us in your mercy. Grant us the grace to be ashamed of what men have done, to be ashamed of having despised and destroyed our own flesh, which you formed from the earth, to which you gave life, with your own breath of life. And he ends by saying, never again, Lord, never again. Amen.
Thank you. Now we have a thought-provoking question that could be addressed to all three panelists. So far this sounds like a love fest, which certainly is a good. But how do we address the fundamentalism that does not allow for this kind of openness?
I'm willing to take a stab at that because I think the initial premise is correct. It is a love fest, and it must be a love fest. I was once talking to a reporter of religion, and he said to me, "Oh, Rabbi, this interfaith stuff, it's all kumbaya." So first of all, I'm a child of the 60s. I always thought kumbaya was a good thing. But I said to the reporter, well, if you had a choice between kumbaya and people shooting one another, what would you go for? And he had the grace to blush and say, my editor would choose shooting every time. And I think that's part of what we're faced with. In a culture where they're going to pick shooting every time, we have the opportunity as religious leaders, literally to have a pulpit, to stand up and preach love and practice love. I was giving a lecture in South Florida a number of winters ago, and it was on Islam. And before I could even start the lecture, a little old Jewish lady stood up and said, what about Sharia? And God inspired me in that moment. And I sang to her, the most beautiful word I ever heard, Sharia. And of course, everyone laughed because they knew the parody, but it broke the ice. And then I was actually able to talk about Sharia and talk about how Sharia is similar to Jewish halakha. It is a way by which we live. It is a path we walk. And while I was at it, I said, and in the Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament, they talk about Hehodos, the way. We all share the way. And the way is the way to one another and the way to God. So yes, fundamentalists will be resistant. And we just have to bang our head against that wall day in, day out, or if you prefer, push the rock up the hill every day. and then start again the next day. That is our obligation.
I would say very quickly, just to, as said at the beginning, I'm involved in the School for Entrepreneurship at the Catholic University of America. And I think the first thing a business person or entrepreneur learns, and especially during these very difficult times, is failure. You can't be a business person without taking on board failure as well. And, you know, just think about it in terms of the project of fraternity for the whole of humanity. St. Francis's mission was a total and absolute failure. The only people he ended up converting were some of the local clergy and bishops who needed bad converting, let me say. But Pope Francis, you know, says that St. Francis felt himself a brother to the sun, to the wind, the sea, yet he knew that he was even closer to those of his own flesh. So, like, I would say that, you know, I've to always begin again, and failure is a chance, even with those where I think dialogue is not possible whatsoever. If we don't have that dynamic, we will not be able to begin again.
I appreciate Bert, you making that distinction about the Sharia and how this is something that is present throughout, you know, multiple faith traditions. I think about something that Imam Muhammad said. He talked about shared freedom space and the responsibility of like-minded, of free people, right? Of the responsibility of free people to use their responsibility to protect that which is most important to humanity, right? And that is, in a nutshell, it is our right to live dignified lives, to live lives free of hostility, persecution, and that means that we have to have a shared commitment to that. When I think about the Quran, the word mu'min, which means believer, it is used way more than the word Muslim, right? The word, so this word, this idea of believer, and the believers are defined, right? And I don't even want to have a terminal definition, but I'll simply say, when, for those of us who are here, are included in that description of what it is to be a believer. And there has to be social accord and commitment in terms of how that belief translates into holding back, not just holding back, because I don't want to speak from a reactionary standpoint, but establishing a culture where every person feels a sense of worth, feels a sense of dignity, that they do not feel like that ignored stranger who is in need and people are walking by, but they feel that they are cared for. And when that exists, because you're never going to fully root out those who are going to have separatist types of views, but you greatly diminish their ability to attract the dispossessed, to attract those who are frustrated, who feel like they're living in a space that does not recognize them, that does not recognize their inherent human dignity. So that is I think the greatest defense that we have collectively against those mindsets that want to splinter off and want to paint everyone else who doesn't see things the way they do as the enemy. The best thing that we can do is our collective action, our collective commitment towards upholding human dignity beyond the pulpit, the minbar, and making sure that translates into policy. That's one of the things that I did take from Fratelli Tutti, is there has to be a practical, a physical manifestation of that belief.
Thank you so much, Tariq, and thank you to all our panelists, Bert, John. This was a very interesting exchange. I want also to thank all those that participated. So unfortunately, we are out of time. There are several more questions in the Q&A box, and we will print them out, and maybe we will send them to you so that you can answer directly. I'm not sure exactly how we will reach the people that ask the question, because they are, most of them, anonymous. But again, thank you to all. Tomorrow you will get an email with some instruction and some resources to continue this dialogue. This is not an end. It's really only a beginning for all of us, really. So thank you, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Goodbye.